Donald Trump's shocking diner encounter, lessons in confidence and resilience. Imagine walking into a diner where the walls scream rebellion, the air hums with clashing ideologies, and a single visitor ignites a storm of debate. This is Liberty Diner, a place where apple pie meets audacity, and a chance encounter with Donald Trump unravels a raw, unscripted clash of confidence and conviction. What happens when a man known for towering ego steps into a world that hates pretense? Buckle up, because this story isn't just about politics, it's about the power of persistence. Oh, and before we dive into the chaos, smash that subscribe button and join our community of curious minds. You won't want to miss what comes next. The sun hung low over the Miami coastline, casting a golden hue across the horizon as waves rhythmically kissed the shore. Nestled between palm trees swaying lazily in the salty breeze, the Liberty Diner stood like an unassuming yet vibrant gem. Its exterior was modest, a small, weathered building painted in faded pastel tones, but inside, it buzzed with life, laughter, and an undeniable sense of chaos that somehow felt comforting rather than overwhelming. Liberty Diner wasn't just any ordinary eatery, it was a microcosm of Miami itself, a melting pot of cultures, opinions, and stories waiting to be told. As one stepped through its doors, they were greeted by walls adorned with graffiti art so bold and colorful that it seemed alive. Each mural told a story. Some depicted political protests, others celebrated freedom, and a few simply expressed raw human emotions, love, anger, hope, all intertwined into this eclectic tapestry of expression. The air inside carried the mingling scents of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and warm apple pie, a fragrance that could make even the most reluctant passerby pause and reconsider their plans. The chatter of patrons filled the space, punctuated occasionally by bursts of laughter or the clinking of cutlery against plates. It was noisy, yes, but there was something inherently inviting about the den. It whispered promises of good food, better company, and perhaps even unexpected encounters. At a corner table near the window, where sunlight streamed in through slightly grimy glass panes, sat Donald Trump. He had entered the diner moments earlier, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his relatively understated arrival. Gone were the days when Secret Service agents flanked him at every turn. Today, he walked alone, clad in his signature sharp suit and crimson tie, a man who still exuded authority without uttering a single word. Trump's decision to visit Liberty Diner stemmed from curiosity more than anything else. During a recent interview on a local radio show, someone had mentioned the place, raving about its legendary apple pie, the kind that makes you forget all your troubles, they'd said. Intrigued, Trump decided to see for himself whether such hype held merit. After all, if there was one thing he appreciated, it was excellence, and if these claims proved true, then this humble diner might very well deserve recognition beyond its current reputation. As he settled into his seat, Trump took stock of his surroundings. His eyes scanned the room methodically, taking note of each detail: the mismatched chairs, the chipped formica countertops, the jukebox tucked away in the far corner playing old-school rock and roll tunes. Despite its apparent disarray, there was charm here, a certain authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. This wasn't a place designed to impress tourists or cater to high society. No, Liberty Diner served those seeking solace amidst life's unpredictability, offering sustenance not only for the body but also for the soul. His gaze eventually landed on the staff moving briskly between tables, balancing trays laden with steaming dishes. They wore uniforms bearing the diner's logo, a stylized eagle clutching a fork and knife, but individuality shone through nonetheless. One waitress sported neon pink streaks in her hair while another proudly displayed tattoos peeking out from beneath rolled-up sleeves. Their energy was infectious, fueling the lively atmosphere permeating every inch of the establishment. Despite feeling somewhat out of place amongst this bohemian crowd, Trump found himself oddly intrigued. Perhaps it was the stark contrast between this setting and the polished boardrooms he typically frequented. Or maybe it was the anticipation of tasting that famed apple pie everyone spoke so highly of. Whatever the reason, he leaned back in his chair, crossed his legs casually, and prepared to embrace whatever surprises awaited him within these four walls. Little did he know, however, that his visit would prove far more eventful than anticipated. For nestled among the friendly faces and cheerful banter lurked undercurrents of dissent, opinions shaped by headlines, biases formed through media portrayals, and judgments passed based solely on appearances. And soon enough, Donald Trump would find himself navigating not only the menu but also the complex web of human perception woven tightly around him. The moment Donald Trump stepped further into the diner, the atmosphere shifted palpably. It was as if an invisible ripple had spread across the room, disturbing the otherwise harmonious buzz of conversations and clinking dishes. Some patrons turned their heads in curiosity, others whispered behind raised hands, and a few simply stared openly, their expressions ranging from admiration to outright disdain. Among the first to react was Carlos, a young man seated at a nearby booth with a half-eaten burger before him. His eyes widened in recognition, and without hesitation, he sprang to his feet, clapping enthusiastically. "Mr. Trump," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with excitement. "You're my hero. I've read all your books, they inspired me to start my own business." Trump raised an eyebrow, amused by the unexpected enthusiasm. He offered Carlos a polite nod and a small wave, acknowledging the compliment without overindulging in it. "Thank you, young man," he said smoothly, his tone carrying just the right mix of warmth and authority. "It's always good to meet someone with ambition." But not everyone shared Carlos' sentiment. Across the room, Clara, the waitress with striking blue hair and piercing green eyes, remained conspicuously silent. She stood frozen for a brief second, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched Trump settle into his seat. Then, without a word, she turned away, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as she busied herself refilling coffee cups at another table. Thompson, the diner's manager, noticed Clara's reaction immediately. He frowned slightly but chose not to intervene, not yet anyway. Instead, he approached Trump cautiously, forcing a smile onto his face. "Good afternoon, sir," he greeted, his voice steady despite the tension simmering beneath the surface. "Welcome to Liberty Diner. Can I get you something to drink while you look over the menu?" Trump leaned back in his chair, studying Thompson with a calculating gaze. Mr. Thompson, is it?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I hear your apple pie is legendary. But tell me," he paused, tilting his head slightly, "why does your staff seem so divided about my presence here?" Thompson hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the inquiry. Before he could formulate a response, Clara reappeared, her expression unreadable but her posture rigid. Without making eye contact, she addressed Thompson rather than Trump. "I'm not serving him," she stated flatly, her voice low but firm. "He can find someone else." A hush fell over the diner. Even the jukebox seemed to quiet down momentarily, as though even the music sensed the gravity of the situation. Several pairs of eyes darted between Clara, Trump, and Thompson, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. Trump, however, didn't appear fazed. If anything, he looked intrigued. Leaning forward slightly, he fixed Clara with a penetrating stare. "And why is that, miss?" he prompted, leaving the sentence hanging as if inviting her to fill in the blanks. "Clara," Thompson interjected quickly, shooting her a warning glance. "Her name is Clara." "Clara," Trump repeated, rolling the syllables off his tongue like a connoisseur sampling fine wine. "Well, Clara, care to explain why you're refusing to serve me? Or should I guess?" He smirked faintly, clearly enjoying the challenge. Clara's jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment it seemed as though she might walk away altogether. But then, summoning what little composure she had left, she met his gaze squarely. "Because I don't believe in bragging," she shot back, her words sharp enough to cut glass. "Your whole life is one big advertisement for yourself. That's not inspiring, it's exhausting." For a heartbeat, the entire diner held its breath. Trump blinked once, slowly, as if processing her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he chuckled softly. "Fair point," he admitted, leaning back again. "But let me ask you this. Do you think people would remember me if I didn't talk about my achievements? Would they listen if I stayed quiet?" Before Clara could respond, Carlos chimed in, unable to contain himself any longer. "That's exactly what makes him great," he argued passionately. "If you don't promote yourself, no one else will. Isn't that right, Mr. Trump?" Trump nodded approvingly. "Precisely, young man. Confidence isn't arrogance, it's necessity. You have to sell yourself before anyone else will buy into your vision." Clara rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. "There's a difference between confidence and narcissism," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. This time, Trump didn't laugh. Instead, he regarded her thoughtfully, his expression softening ever so slightly. Perhaps he conceded. "But tell me, Clara, have you ever tried failing publicly? Have you put yourself out there, only to be rejected 6 times before finally succeeding? Because that's where real confidence comes from. Not from hiding behind cynicism." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Clara opened her mouth to retort but found herself at a loss. For the first time since Trump's arrival, uncertainty flickered across her features. Sensing the shift in dynamics, Thompson seized the opportunity to diffuse the tension. "Why don't we focus on getting you that apple pie, Mr. Trump?" he suggested diplomatically. "Let's not let politics ruin a perfectly good meal, shall we?" Trump grinned, clearly pleased with how things were unfolding. An excellent suggestion, Mr. Thompson. After all, I didn't come here for debate, I came for dessert. As Thompson ushered Clara aside to discuss next steps, Trump glanced around the diner once more. The initial shock of his presence had subsided, replaced by a curious blend of admiration, skepticism, and cautious optimism. Little did they know the real story was only beginning to unfold. As the tension in the diner began to settle into a fragile calm, Mr. Thompson seized the opportunity to guide Donald Trump toward a quieter corner of the establishment. It wasn't an official meeting room. Liberty Diner didn't have one, but a small booth tucked away near the jukebox, where the ambient noise provided just enough cover for a private conversation. Thompson gestured for Trump to take a seat, his movements deliberate yet tinged with nervous energy. Mr. Trump, Thompson began, folding his hands on the table as if bracing himself for what was to come, I apologize for Clara's behavior. She's passionate about her beliefs. Trump raised a hand dismissively, his trademark smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. No need to apologize, Mr. Thompson. Passion is something I understand very well. In fact, it's what drives success or failure depending on how you handle it. Thompson nodded slowly, unsure whether this was a compliment or a veiled critique. He decided to steer the conversation toward safer territory. You mentioned earlier that you're here for our apple pie. I assure you it's worth the wait. But may I ask, what brings you to Liberty Diner specifically? Trump leaned back in the booth, crossing one leg over the other in a posture that exuded confidence. Let's just say I heard good things. People talk, Mr. Thompson. And when they talk about excellence, I listen. The manager chuckled nervously, though there was no mistaking the sincerity in Trump's tone. Well, we do our best to live up to expectations. But I must admit, your presence here has stirred quite the debate among my staff and customers for that matter. At that moment, Carlos appeared, seemingly drawn by the gravitational pull of Trump's charisma. The young man hesitated for a brief second before sliding into the booth beside Thompson. Sorry to interrupt, he said, glancing between the two men, but I couldn't help overhearing. Mr. Trump, I have a question if you don't mind. Trump arched an eyebrow, intrigued. Go ahead, young man. Questions are the foundation of growth. Carlos took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. Do you ever think you go too far with self-promotion? Like, some people say you're not just confident, you're arrogant. The question hung in the air, sharp and unfiltered. Trump didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. That's a fair observation, Carlos. Let me tell you something, confidence and arrogance are often confused because they look similar on the surface. But here's the difference, confidence comes from action. Arrogance comes from insecurity. He paused, letting the word sink in. When I write books, build hotels, or even run for office, I'm not doing it to boast. I'm doing it because I believe in the power of vision. If you don't believe in yourself, why should anyone else? Carlos frowned, clearly wrestling with the response. But isn't there a line? Where does confidence end and arrogance begin? Trump smiled faintly, his gaze steady. It's simple, really. Confidence inspires others. Arrogance alienates them. The key is knowing your audience and staying true to your values. Before Carlos could respond, Clara emerged from behind the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. So what you're saying, she interjected, her voice laced with skepticism, is that bragging is okay as long as it gets results? Trump turned to face her fully, his demeanor unwavering. Not bragging, Clara. Branding. There's a distinction. Bragging is empty, branding is strategic. You see, every great leader understands the importance of perception. If you want people to follow you, you have to give them a reason to believe. Clara opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. For the first time, doubt crept into her rigid stance. She glanced at Thompson, who offered an encouraging nod, then back at Trump. And what happens when people don't believe? She challenged. What happens when they call you out for failing? Trump's smile softened, almost imperceptibly. Now that's where the real lesson lies. Failure isn't the opposite of success, it's part of the process. I've been rejected more times than I can count. Banks turned me down. Investors walked away. Critics laughed. But each failure taught me something valuable. You see, Clara, resilience isn't about avoiding rejection. It's about learning to negotiate with it. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. Even Clara seemed momentarily disarmed, her defenses cracking under the force of his conviction. It was Carlos who broke the silence, his voice quieter now, reflective. My dad used to dream of starting his own business, he admitted, staring down at the table. But he never took the leap. He always said he wasn't ready, that he needed more experience or capital. Eventually, he stopped dreaming altogether. He looked up at Trump, his eyes searching. Do you think he lacked confidence or courage? Trump regarded him thoughtfully, his usual bravado tempered by empathy. Both, perhaps. Confidence without courage is like a car without fuel. It might look impressive, but it won't get you anywhere. Your father had potential, Carlos. Don't let his story define yours. The young man nodded slowly, visibly moved. Clara, meanwhile, lingered silently, her earlier hostility replaced by a quiet contemplation. She retreated to the counter, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. Trump watched her go, his expression unreadable but undeniably knowing. As the conversation wound down, Thompson cleared his throat, signaling a shift back to practical matters. Shall I have Claire bring out that apple pie now, Mr. Trump? Or would you prefer another drink while you wait? Trump grinned, his characteristic charm returning in full force. The pie sounds perfect, Mr. Thompson. After all, I didn't come here for philosophy, I came for dessert. With that, the tension in the diner began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of curiosity and connection. Little did anyone realize, however, that the most transformative moments were still yet to come. The diner had settled into a quieter rhythm, the earlier tension giving way to an almost meditative stillness. Donald Trump sat at his booth, sipping a freshly brewed cup of coffee as he recounted a story from his past, a tale that few outside his inner circle had ever heard. His voice, usually commanding and assertive, now carried a reflective tone, as though he were speaking not just to those present but also to himself. When I was younger, Trump began, his gaze distant, people called me a dreamer. Not in the romantic sense, mind you, but in the dismissive way. They thought my ambitions were absurd. I wanted to build something extraordinary, something that would leave a mark on the world. But every time I pitched an idea, I faced rejection. He paused, swirling the remnants of his coffee in the mug. I remember one particular meeting with a group of bankers. I walked in with a vision for a grand hotel, something no one had seen before. They laughed at me. Who do you think you are? They asked. You're just a kid with big dreams and no experience. Carlos leaned forward, captivated by the vulnerability in Trump's voice. Clara, who had initially intended to stay out of sight, found herself lingering near the counter, her curiosity piqued. She told herself she was only listening to gather ammunition for later, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. I didn't give up, Trump continued, his tone firming slightly. I went back to them 6 times, each time refining my proposal, sharpening my arguments. On the 7th attempt, they finally agreed to lend me the money. That project became the foundation of everything I built afterward. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. She had always prided herself on being pragmatic, on rejecting what she saw as empty bravado. But hearing Trump speak about failure, not as a defeat but as a stepping stone, made her question her own assumptions. Was his confidence truly arrogance, or was it something else entirely? Trump glanced toward Clara, sensing her presence even though she tried to remain inconspicuous. People see success and assume it came easily, he said, his voice softening. They don't see the years of struggle, the nights spent wondering if you'll ever make it. Confidence isn't about pretending you're invincible, it's about believing in your vision even when others don't. For Clara, these words struck a chord. Her father had been a musician, a man with immense talent but little faith in himself. He'd spent years playing small gigs, never daring to pursue bigger opportunities because he feared rejection. Eventually, he stopped performing altogether, retreating into a life of quiet resignation. Clara had vowed never to let anyone manipulate her emotions the way his failures had manipulated hers. And yet here she was, confronted by a man whose persistence seemed almost admirable. Unable to resist any longer, Clara stepped forward, her movements hesitant but deliberate. She carried a plate in her hands, a slice of warm apple pie, its golden crust glistening under the diner's dim lights. Placing it gently on the table in front of Trump, she met his gaze for the first time since his arrival. I hate bragging, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. It feels hollow, like people are trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. But she hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. I respect someone who dares to fail. Who keeps going even when the odds are against them. Trump studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly a smile spread across his face. Thank you, Clara, he said simply, picking up his fork. That's all I ask, for people to listen, to understand where I'm coming from. Sometimes the loudest voices carry the most pain. As Clara returned to the counter, she felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had lifted. Around the diner, the atmosphere shifted once again, this time infused with a newfound mutual respect. Even Thompson, who had been quietly observing from afar, allowed himself a small smile. Carlos watched the exchange, his admiration for Trump growing with each passing moment. "You know," he said softly, "my dad used to say that fear is just excitement without the confidence." Maybe he was right. Trump chuckled, taking a bite of the pie. Maybe he was, he agreed. And maybe your dad just needed someone to remind him of his own potential. The conversation tapered off naturally, leaving behind a sense of closure that hadn't existed before. For the first time since Trump's arrival, Liberty Diner felt less like a battleground and more like a sanctuary, a place where differences could coexist, where stories could be shared, and where understanding could take root. As the sun dipped lower on the Miami horizon, casting long shadows across Liberty Diner, Donald Trump prepared to leave. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed dramatically since his arrival. What began as a tense standoff had evolved into something far more profound: understanding. Clara stood behind the counter, her earlier hostility replaced by a quiet respect. Carlos lingered at his booth, lost in thought, while Thompson watched from a distance, visibly relieved that the situation had resolved itself without further conflict. Trump rose from his seat, straightening his crimson tie with a practiced motion. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp bill and placing it on the table. Then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, he added another, doubling the tip. "For Clara," he said aloud, loud enough for her to hear. "And tell her I'll be back next time," with even more bragging. Clara couldn't help but smirk, shaking her head slightly. For all his bravado, there was an undeniable charm to the man, a mix of confidence and wit that made it hard to stay angry. She nodded silently, acknowledging the gesture as Trump turned toward the exit. Before stepping outside, he paused briefly, glancing back at the eclectic interior of the diner one last time. The graffiti-covered walls, the clinking dishes, the hum of conversation, it all felt strangely familiar now, like a microcosm of the world he'd spent decades navigating. Each mural told a story, much like each person here carried their own struggles and triumphs. And today he'd become part of that tapestry, however briefly. The drive back along the coast was serene, the rhythmic sound of waves providing a soothing backdrop to Trump's thoughts. As he navigated the winding road, his mind replayed the events of the afternoon, the heated debates, the heartfelt confessions, the subtle shifts in perception. It wasn't often that he allowed himself such introspection, but tonight the solitude seemed to demand it. "Rejection isn't scary," he mused aloud, his voice barely audible over the hum of the car engine. "What's truly frightening is letting fear stop you from challenging prejudice." He smiled faintly, recalling Clara's words about hating bragging but respecting resilience. Her honesty had struck a chord within him, reminding him of the delicate balance between confidence and arrogance, a line he'd walked his entire life. He thought about Carlos, whose admiration had been tempered by skepticism, and how the young man's father had let self-doubt extinguish his dreams. It was a sobering reminder of how fragile ambition could be, how easily it could be crushed under the weight of rejection or ridicule. Yet it also underscored the importance of perseverance, the relentless pursuit of a vision, even when others couldn't see it. For Trump, success had never been about avoiding failure. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and using it as fuel to push forward. Every setback had been a lesson, every critic a motivator. And perhaps that was the message he hoped people would take away, not just from his books or speeches, but from moments like this, where vulnerability met authenticity. Back at Liberty Diner, life resumed its usual rhythm. Clara returned to her duties, serving customers with renewed energy. She found herself smiling more, engaging with patrons in ways she hadn't before. The encounter with Trump had left an indelible mark, forcing her to confront her own biases and assumptions. Confidence, she realized, wasn't inherently toxic, it was simply misunderstood, often conflated with arrogance when it stemmed from genuine belief. Carlos, meanwhile, sat scribbling notes in a small journal, jotting down ideas for his fledgling business venture. Inspired by Trump's stories of persistence, he vowed not to let fear dictate his future. His father's cautionary tale no longer felt like a burden, instead, it served as a catalyst for change. Thompson observed these transformations with quiet satisfaction. Liberty Diner had always been a place of contrasts, a melting pot of opinions, emotions, and experiences. Today it had lived up to its name in more ways than one, offering freedom not just in expression but in understanding. As Trump's car disappeared into the distance, the final rays of sunlight faded, leaving the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. Somewhere along the coastline, a seagull cried out, its call echoing across the water. Life moved on as it always did, carrying with it the lessons of the day. In the end, the true essence of the story lay not in the clash of ideologies, but in the connections forged through dialogue. Confidence, when rooted in authenticity, could bridge divides. Arrogance, born of insecurity, only widened them. And sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen not in boardrooms or rallies, but in humble settings like Liberty Diner, where hearts opened, minds shifted, and humanity shone brightest.